In 1919, the First World War ended with the defeat of the German Empire and the formal conclusion of hostilities in Europe. The war had resulted in unprecedented casualties, territorial changes, and political collapse across the continent. In Germany, military defeat was followed by the abdication of the monarchy and the establishment of a republican government. The post-war settlement imposed territorial losses, military restrictions, and reparations obligations on Germany. These measures were administered through international agreements and enforcement mechanisms that shaped German political, economic, and institutional life during the interwar years. Between 1919 and 1939, Germany underwent repeated transformations in governance, economic structure, and state authority. Civilian institutions operated under external constraint, internal instability, and shifting legal frameworks. Political power changed hands through constitutional procedures, emergency decrees, and administrative reorganization. Military structures were dismantled, reorganized, expanded, and eventually restored under revised authority. Economic systems experienced inflation, stabilization, collapse, and rearmament-driven growth. Foreign policy shifted between compliance, negotiation, and unilateral action within the evolving international order. In 1939, Germany initiated military operations in Poland, triggering a conflict that expanded beyond earlier expectations. What followed was a war that involved multiple continents, mobilized entire societies, and altered the structure of states, economies, and populations on an unprecedented scale. This documentary examines World War II from the German perspective, tracing the period from First World War defeat in 1919 through war, collapse, occupation, and political reformation by 1949. It follows the actions of German state institutions, military commands, economic systems, and administrative authorities as recorded in contemporary documentation. In 1919, Germany transitioned from wartime conditions to peacetime administration following the cessation of hostilities in the First World War. Armed conflict had ended with the armistice of November 11, 1918. The political authority that conducted the war no longer existed. On November 9, 1918, the German emperor abdicated. Authority passed to a civilian government formed amid revolution, demobilization, and shortages. This government assumed responsibility for concluding peace negotiations initiated by the victorious powers. Germany did not participate in drafting the peace terms. On June 28, 1919, German representatives signed the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty required Germany to accept responsibility for the war, cede territory, dismantle its armed forces, surrender overseas colonies, and undertake financial obligations. Territorial provisions transferred Alsace-Lorraine to France, awarded territory in the east to the newly established Polish state, and removed all German colonial possessions. Approximately 13% of Germany's pre-war territory and 10% of its population were affected. Military provisions limited the German army to 100,000 volunteers. Conscription was prohibited. Tanks, military aircraft, submarines, and heavy artillery were banned. The general staff was dissolved. Naval forces were restricted in size and armament. Financial provisions imposed reparations. The total obligation was later fixed at 132 billion gold marks. The treaty entered into force through German legal procedures. The National Assembly passed legislation to implement military reductions, dissolve units, and transfer authority in occupied regions. Administrative compliance proceeded through ministerial orders and regulatory enforcement. The post-war army, later designated the Reichswehr, carried out mandated reductions. Units were disbanded. Command structures were reorganized. Training programs were revised to conform to numerical limits. Rank hierarchies and officer commissions were retained within the authorized strength. Civilian ministries addressed implementation tasks. The Ministry of Finance began assessing reparations liabilities. Transport and labor ministries managed demobilization and employment transitions for millions of returning soldiers. The Foreign Office initiated diplomatic communication with former adversaries and neutral states. Economic conditions in 1919 reflected wartime disruption. Food rationing continued in urban areas. Industrial output remained below pre-war levels. Inflation persisted. Demobilization placed pressure on labor markets. Veterans organizations expanded rapidly. Political violence occurred in multiple regions. Armed clashes between political groups took place in Berlin, Central Germany, and the Ruhr. Strikes were recorded across industrial sectors. Elections to the National Assembly in January 1919 produced a coalition government. Parliamentary records from mid-1919 document extensive debate over the treaty's provisions. Enabling legislation was passed while opposition parties issued formal objections. Article 231 of the treaty became the subject of repeated parliamentary statements and party resolutions. Government communications described acceptance of the clause as a requirement for ending the occupation and resuming international relations. Political parties and newspapers published objections to its wording and implications. Throughout 1919, treaty obligations were implemented through legislation, administrative action, and military restructuring. Parallel diplomatic efforts sought modification of specific provisions through negotiation and international appeal. No referendum was held on the treaty. No judicial review occurred. Parliamentary debate on the settlement continued after ratification. By the end of 1919, Germany had completed demobilization under treaty terms. Territorial changes were in effect. Armed forces had been reduced and reorganized. Reparations obligations had been acknowledged. Political debate over the settlement remained active within the parliamentary system. In 1920, Germany operated under the legal and administrative framework established by the Treaty of Versailles. Military, political, and economic systems function within externally defined limits while addressing the immediate consequences of demobilization, territorial loss, and financial obligation. The armed forces were reorganized under treaty provisions. By January 1, 1921, the German army had been reduced to the authorized strength of 100,000 personnel, divided into 7 infantry divisions and 3 cavalry divisions. The Navy was limited to 15,000 personnel, with restrictions on ship classes, tonnage, and armament. Conscription remained prohibited. Officer commissions were capped, and enlistment terms were extended to ensure continuity within the reduced force. The General Staff, formally dissolved under the treaty, was replaced by administrative offices responsible for training, personnel management, and logistics. These offices operated under civilian oversight and were restricted to non-operational planning. Training emphasized drill, discipline, and command procedure within authorized structures. Weapons prohibited under the treaty were removed from inventories, destroyed, or surrendered under Allied supervision. Military reductions proceeded through formal orders and inspections. Allied control commissions monitored compliance, conducted site visits, and reviewed records. German authorities provided documentation of unit disbandment, personnel discharge, and equipment disposal. Compliance was enforced through administrative mechanisms rather than military resistance. Civil administration addressed parallel pressures. Demobilization released millions of former soldiers into the civilian labor market between 1919 and 1921. The Ministry of Labor coordinated employment programs, vocational retraining, and public works were available. Unemployment fluctuated as wartime industries contracted and peacetime production remained limited. Economic conditions remained unstable. Inflation continued through 1920, driven by wartime debt, reduced industrial output, and fiscal strain. The German mark depreciated steadily against foreign currencies. Tax revenues declined relative to expenditures, and budget deficits persisted. The Ministry of Finance relied increasingly on short-term borrowing to meet obligations. Reparations administration began in earnest during this period. Although the total sum was finalized later, interim payments and deliveries were required. Germany provided coal shipments, industrial equipment, and agricultural goods to the Allied powers as part of the reparation schedules. These transfers affected domestic supply and industrial planning. Territorial adjustments implemented in 1919 continued to affect governance. Border regions transferred to neighboring states required administrative separation, population relocation, and property reassignment. German authorities processed citizenship changes, compensation claims, and pension transfers for affected residents. Internal security remained a central concern. Political violence persisted in multiple regions. Paramilitary organizations, including former volunteer units formed during demobilization, were active throughout 1920. The government issued decrees restricting armed groups and authorized police operations to restore order. These actions were conducted through civilian law enforcement rather than military deployment, in accordance with treaty limitations. In March 1920, an attempted coup disrupted administrative continuity. Civil servants, military units, and regional authorities responded unevenly. The event was resolved through a general strike rather than sustained armed conflict. Following the collapse of the coup, the government enacted measures to reinforce loyalty within the civil service and police forces. Personnel reviews and disciplinary actions followed. Throughout 1920, ministries emphasized procedural continuity. Civil servants retained their positions under existing administrative law. Record-keeping, budgeting, and regulatory enforcement continued despite political instability. Courts remained operational, and legal proceedings proceeded under Republican statutes. Foreign policy during this period focused on compliance and stabilization. The Foreign Office engaged with Allied representatives to address implementation disputes, inspection procedures, and timelines. Diplomatic missions were maintained in neutral and former enemy states. Germany sought relief from certain delivery obligations through negotiation rather than unilateral action. In 1921, the Allied powers finalized the reparations framework. On May 5, 1921, the London Schedule of Payments established the total reparations obligation at 132 billion gold marks. Payment terms included annual installments, bonds, and in-kind deliveries. The schedule formalized Germany's financial responsibilities and linked compliance to continued occupation status in the Rhineland. The German government accepted the schedule under protest. Parliamentary debates recorded objections to the amount and structure of the obligation. Nonetheless, enabling legislation authorized payments and deliveries. Administrative agencies adjusted fiscal planning to meet imposed requirements. Military administration continued under inspection. Personnel records were updated to reflect enlistment limits. Training schedules were standardized. Officer promotion was regulated to prevent expansion beyond authorized ranks. Equipment inventories were audited regularly by Allied inspectors. Civil-military separation was reinforced. Military authorities were prohibited from involvement in internal security operations. Police forces expanded in size and responsibility to compensate. State and municipal police units were reorganized, re-equipped, and trained to address public order challenges. Economic pressures intensified following the reparations decision. Currency depreciation accelerated in mid-1921. Prices rose sharply. Wages lagged behind inflation. Industrial firms faced difficulty securing credit and raw materials. Coal deliveries reduced domestic supply during the winter months, affecting households and factories. Labor unrest increased. Strikes were recorded in the mining, transport, and manufacturing sectors. Collective bargaining mechanisms remained in place, but outcomes were uneven. Government mediation efforts focused on maintaining production and preventing disruption to reparation deliveries. Social welfare systems expanded modestly. War pensions, disability benefits, and unemployment assistance placed additional strain on public finances. Administrative capacity limited coverage and enforcement. Regional disparities persisted. Throughout 1920 to 1921, institutional structures remained intact. Ministries functioned according to statutory authority. Military organizations operated within imposed limits. Courts, police, and civil services continued routine operations. Political conflict occurred within parliamentary and legal frameworks rather than through sustained insurrection. No national referendum altered treaty obligations. No constitutional amendment reversed compliance measures. Administrative actions proceeded under existing law. By the end of 1921, Germany remained bound by treaty constraints and reparation schedules. Armed forces operated at authorized strength. Civil administration managed ongoing economic and social pressures. Diplomatic engagement focused on modification through negotiation rather than defiance. The state continued to function under externally defined conditions, maintaining institutional operations while implementing imposed obligations through legal and administrative means. In 1922, Germany operated within the legal framework of the Treaty of Versailles while facing continued diplomatic isolation, fiscal pressure, and economic instability. State institutions functioned under externally imposed obligations while managing domestic constraints arising from reparation deliveries, currency depreciation, and reduced industrial capacity. At the beginning of the year, Germany remained subject to Allied supervision. Reparations deliveries continued in the form of coal, timber, manufactured goods, and financial transfers. The Rhineland remained under Allied occupation. Compliance mechanisms included inspections, reporting requirements, and enforcement measures tied to delivery schedules. Economic conditions remained unstable. The German mark continued to depreciate against foreign currencies throughout 1922. government revenues failed to match expenditures. The Ministry of Finance relied increasingly on monetary expansion to cover budget deficits. Price levels rose steadily, affecting wages, pensions, and public procurement. Industrial production fluctuated due to limited access to raw materials and reduced domestic demand. Fiscal administration adjusted to these conditions through emergency measures. Tax collection mechanisms were revised. Short-term treasury instruments were issued. State and municipal budgets faced widening gaps. Public sector employment levels were maintained despite declining real wages. Foreign policy activity focused on navigating Germany's restricted position within the international system. Diplomatic representation was restored gradually in several capitals, though Germany remained excluded from major multilateral decision-making forums related to reparations enforcement and security arrangements. In April 1922, Germany participated in the Genoa Conference, an international economic meeting convened to address post-war reconstruction, financial stabilization, and relations with the former belligerents. German delegates attended without voting authority on key enforcement issues. Discussions did not produce binding agreements on reparations relief or financial restructuring. During the conference, Germany concluded a bilateral agreement with the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. On April 16, 1922, representatives of both states signed the Treaty of Rapallo. The treaty established mutual diplomatic recognition, renounced financial claims arising from the war, and restored normal trade relations. The treaty did not include military alliances, joint defense commitments, or security guarantees. Its provisions addressed diplomatic status, economic exchange, and legal claims. German-Russian trade agreements followed, facilitating commercial transactions outside existing Western European frameworks. The conclusion of the Rapallo Treaty altered Germany's diplomatic position. Allied governments issued formal protests. Diplomatic correspondence records objections to the timing and symbolism of the agreement rather than to its legal content. No treaty clauses violated existing international law. Within Germany, the treaty entered into force through standard ratification procedures. The Foreign Office expanded diplomatic staffing in Moscow. Trade missions were established. Commercial contracts were negotiated between German firms and Russian agencies. These activities occurred within civilian administrative channels. Throughout 1922, Germany continued to engage with Allied authorities regarding reparation deliveries. Disputes arose over delivery schedules, valuation methods, and compliance verification. The Reparation Commission issued notices citing delays and deficiencies. German ministries submitted revised schedules and logistical reports. Coal deliveries remained a central issue. Mining output declined due to labor unrest, equipment shortages, and reduced investment. Deliveries to foreign recipients reduced domestic availability, affecting energy supply for industry and households. Rail transport capacity remained strained. Labor relations deteriorated during the year. Wage agreements failed to keep pace with rising prices. Strikes occurred in the mining, metalworking, and transport sectors. Collective bargaining continued under legal frameworks established after the war, though enforcement varied by region. Political instability persisted. Coalition governments are formed and dissolved through parliamentary procedure. Legislative sessions addressed fiscal measures, labor regulation, and treaty compliance. Parliamentary debates recorded opposition to reparation terms and criticism of government fiscal policy. Public order challenges continued. Police forces responded to demonstrations and strikes using civilian law enforcement authority. Military units remained excluded from internal security operations. Paramilitary organizations remained active, though subject to regulation and periodic disarmament campaigns. Administrative continuity remained intact. Courts operated under Republican law. Civil service appointments continued under statutory procedures. Ministries issued regulations to address shortages, price controls, and supply distribution. Enforcement capacity varied across regions. Currency depreciation accelerated during the second half of 1922. The exchange rate of the mark declined sharply against the U.S. dollar and British pound. Price indices rose accordingly. Savings denominated in marks lost purchasing power. Public confidence in monetary stability weakened, as reflected in increased use of foreign currencies and barter arrangements. The central bank expanded note issuance to meet government financing needs. Monetary controls were insufficient to stabilize exchange rates. Attempts at fiscal consolidation were constrained by reparation obligations and social expenditures. Diplomatic engagement continued alongside economic strain. Germany submitted proposals for reparation adjustment, citing economic capacity and delivery feasibility. These submissions were reviewed by Allied authorities, but did not result in immediate modification of enforcement terms. By the end of 1922, Germany remained bound by treaty obligations while operating within a constrained diplomatic environment. State institutions continued to function under administrative law. Economic conditions deteriorated further. Diplomatic activity diversified through bilateral agreements and trade arrangements conducted outside existing enforcement structures. The year concluded with unresolved disputes over reparations, ongoing currency depreciation, and continued operation of government institutions under externally defined conditions. In 1923, Germany experienced a year of acute political, economic, and administrative crisis under the continued enforcement of post-war obligations. State authority remained formally intact, but its capacity to regulate economic life, maintain public order, and enforce monetary stability deteriorated rapidly. On January 11, 1923, French and Belgian forces entered the Ruhr region. The occupation followed determinations by the Reparation Commission that Germany had failed to meet scheduled deliveries of coal and timber. The Ruhr contained a substantial share of Germany's coal production, steel manufacturing, and heavy industry. Occupying authorities assumed control over railways, mines, and administrative facilities. The German government issued directives for passive resistance. Industrial workers, civil servants, and railway personnel in the occupied zone were instructed not to cooperate with occupying forces. Production declined sharply as work stoppages spread across mining, transport, and manufacturing sectors. The government is committed to compensating workers and firms affected by the policy. Financing of passive resistance relied on monetary expansion. Government expenditures increased significantly while tax revenues from the occupied region declined. The central bank expanded note issuance to meet obligations. The money supply rose rapidly during the first half of the year. Currency depreciation accelerated. In January 1923, the exchange rate stood at approximately 18,000 marks per U.S. dollar. By July, the rate exceeded 350,000 marks per dollar. By November, the rate reached trillions of marks per dollar. Prices adjusted accordingly. Daily price revisions became common in retail and wholesale markets. Wages were paid with increasing frequency. In many sectors, workers received payment multiple times per day. Cash handling volumes increased dramatically. Transport of currency required logistical support. Savings denominated in marks lost value rapidly. Fixed incomes, including pensions and public salaries, were rendered inadequate. The fiscal system ceased to function in conventional terms. Tax assessments lagged behind inflation. Revenues collected in nominal terms lost purchasing power before allocation. Municipal governments struggled to fund basic services. Barter arrangements and foreign currency transactions expanded in response to currency instability. Industrial output in the Ruhr declined substantially. Coal production fell to a fraction of pre-occupation levels. Steel output contracted. Rail transport capacity was disrupted by strikes, sabotage, and administrative division. Deliveries to domestic and foreign recipients declined. The occupation produced frequent confrontations. Arrests of German officials and workers occurred. Expulsions were ordered. Administrative offices were seized. Legal disputes arose over jurisdiction and authority. German courts lacked enforcement capacity in the occupied zone. Outside the Ruhr, economic effects spread rapidly. Energy shortages affected factories and households across the country. Transport bottlenecks disrupted supply chains. Food prices rose sharply. Urban living conditions deteriorated as purchasing power collapsed. Political instability intensified. Cabinet changes occurred during the year. Emergency decrees were issued under constitutional provisions allowing expanded executive authority. Parliamentary debate continued, but legislative influence diminished as executive measures dominated policy response. Public order challenges multiplied. Demonstrations and strikes occurred in multiple regions. Police forces were deployed to maintain order. Military units remained restricted from internal security roles under treaty limitations. Paramilitary groups continued to operate, often clashing with political opponents. Separatist movements emerged in parts of the Rhineland and Palatinate. Local administrations faced pressure from occupying authorities and separatist groups. The central government issued statements rejecting territorial fragmentation and maintaining administrative claims over affected regions. Political extremism increased. In November 1923, an attempted seizure of power occurred in Bavaria. The action involved paramilitary formations and political figures acting outside constitutional procedures. State police forces intervened. The attempt was suppressed. Arrests and legal proceedings followed. Throughout the year, the judiciary remained operational. Courts processed cases related to currency disputes, labor conflicts, and political violence. Enforcement capacity varied by region due to economic disruption and security constraints. Efforts to stabilize the currency intensified in the second half of the year. Fiscal reforms were introduced. In November 1923, a new currency, the Rentenmark, was issued. The exchange rate was fixed at 1 Rentenmark to 1 trillion paper marks. Note issuance was restricted. The reform was supported by adjustments in fiscal administration and taxation. Passive resistance in the Ruhr was formally ended in September 1923. Government directives instructed workers and officials to resume cooperation with the occupying authorities. Production gradually resumed, though output remained below pre-occupation levels. Negotiations over reparations enforcement continued through diplomatic channels. By the end of 1923, Germany had undergone extreme monetary dislocation, territorial occupation, and political violence while maintaining formal state structures. Administrative systems continued to operate under emergency conditions. Currency stabilization measures were in place, but had not yet restored normal economic function. In 1924, Germany entered a period of administrative stabilization following the monetary reform introduced late the previous year. The Rentenmark, issued in November 1923, remained in circulation as the primary medium of exchange. Currency issuance was restricted. Fiscal procedures were reorganized. Price levels stabilized relative to the final months of hyperinflation. In January 1924, the German government implemented tax reforms designed to restore revenue collection. New assessment schedules were introduced. Tax payments were indexed to stabilize real value. The enforcement authority was expanded for fiscal offices. Municipal governments resumed routine budgetary operations under revised accounting standards. Industrial production resumed unevenly. Coal output in the Ruhr increased following the end of passive resistance. Steel and manufacturing facilities reopened under revised management arrangements. Rail transport services expanded as fuel availability improved. Output levels remained below pre-war benchmarks, but exceeded the depressed levels of 1923. Reparations enforcement remained in place. Allied occupation forces continued to control the Rhineland and selected industrial zones. Inspections and compliance reporting persisted. Disputes over valuation and delivery schedules continued through administrative channels. In April 1924, the Reparation Commission approved a revised framework for payments. The arrangement, commonly referred to as the Dawes Plan, restructured Germany's reparations obligations without canceling the total sum. Annual payments were reduced initially and scheduled to increase gradually. Oversight mechanisms included foreign supervision of key revenue streams. Implementation of the revised framework required legislative action. The German parliament passed enabling laws authorizing the reorganization of the national railway system and the restructuring of fiscal administration. The Reichsbahn was reorganized as a separate entity with revenues pledged toward reparations payments. Oversight boards included foreign representatives. Foreign capital entered the German economy during 1924 to 1925. Loans from American and European financial institutions provided liquidity for industrial modernization and infrastructure repair. Funds were directed toward railways, utilities, housing construction, and municipal services. Loan agreements specified repayment schedules and collateral arrangements. Employment conditions improved in major urban centers. Industrial hiring increased as production expanded. Wage agreements were renegotiated under stabilized currency conditions. Labor disputes continued but occurred within established legal frameworks. Strike activity declined compared to the previous year. The banking system was restructured. Insolvent institutions were merged or liquidated. Credit availability expanded under tighter regulatory oversight. Interest rates stabilized. Commercial lending supported industrial expansion and trade. Political institutions operated under constitutional procedures. Parliamentary coalitions are formed and dissolved through regular legislative processes. Elections held at the state and municipal levels reflected shifting party alignments. Political violence declined relative to 1923, though isolated incidents persisted. Internal security operations remained under civilian authority. Police forces were reorganized and re-equipped. Paramilitary organizations were subject to restrictions and disarmament orders. Enforcement varied by region but proceeded through legal channels. Foreign policy activity increased. Diplomatic relations expanded with European states and the United States. Germany pursued normalization through treaty negotiation and participation in international conferences addressing economic cooperation and security arrangements. In October 1925, Germany concluded the Locarno treaties with France, Belgium, Britain, and Italy. The agreements recognized Germany's western borders as defined by existing treaties. Arbitration mechanisms were established for eastern border disputes. The treaties were ratified by the German parliament in November 1925. As part of the Locarno framework, Germany agreed to restrictions on force in the Rhineland region. In return, the Allied powers committed to arbitration procedures and guarantees against aggression. The agreements did not alter Germany's eastern boundaries, but established diplomatic processes for dispute resolution. Following ratification, Germany's international status improved. In September 1926, Germany was admitted to the League of Nations as a permanent member of the Council. Membership required acceptance of collective security obligations and participation in multilateral decision-making. Military administration continued under treaty constraints. Armed forces remained at authorized strength. Training focused on basic instruction, discipline, and internal organization. Equipment inventories were maintained within permitted categories. Allied inspections continued, though their frequency declined. Civil administration expanded social programs. Housing construction increased, particularly in urban areas affected by wartime damage and post-war shortages. Municipal utilities resumed investment in water, electricity, and transport services. Public health services stabilized following earlier disruptions. Economic growth varied by sector. Export industries benefited from improved access to foreign markets. Domestic consumption increased as wages stabilized. Agricultural production recovered unevenly due to price fluctuations and credit constraints. Public finances improved but remained constrained. Budget surpluses were rare. Debt servicing obligations limited fiscal flexibility. Foreign loan repayments required careful management of export revenues and currency reserves. Political debate continued over the long-term implications of international agreements. Parliamentary records show ongoing discussion of sovereignty, security, and economic dependence. Opposition parties criticized foreign oversight mechanisms. Governing coalitions defended compliance as necessary for stability. Judicial institutions processed cases related to property restitution, currency conversion, and contractual disputes arising from inflation. Courts applied conversion schedules established by statute. Legal precedents developed to address the effects of monetary collapse on private obligations. By 1926, Germany functioned under stabilized currency conditions, revised reparation arrangements, and expanded diplomatic engagement. Industrial production exceeded immediate post-crisis levels. Administrative systems operated under normalized procedures. Occupation forces remained in designated zones. Reparations oversight continued. Foreign financial exposure increased. Domestic political competition persisted within constitutional structures. In 1927, Germany operated under stabilized monetary conditions, revised reparation arrangements, and expanded diplomatic engagement. State institutions functioned under established legal frameworks while remaining subject to external supervision and treaty limitations. Economic activity continued to recover. Industrial production increased in sectors including steel, chemicals, machinery, and electrical goods. Coal output stabilized relative to mid-1920s levels. Rail transport volumes expanded as freight traffic increased. Urban construction activity continued, supported by municipal borrowing and foreign credit. Foreign capital remained a significant component of economic activity. By 1927, outstanding foreign loans exceeded 25 billion Reichsmarks, with a substantial portion originating from the United States. Funds were allocated to industrial modernization, municipal infrastructure, housing development, and public utilities. Loan contracts specified repayment schedules denominated in foreign currency. The banking system expanded credit availability. Commercial banks increased lending to industry and municipalities. Interest rates remained moderate relative to inflation-adjusted levels. Regulatory oversight continued through statutory banking authorities. Public finances remained constrained. Federal and state budgets balanced revenues against expenditure obligations, including reparations payments, debt servicing, and social programs. Tax collections stabilized under reformed assessment procedures. Fiscal surpluses were limited, and borrowing continued to supplement revenue. Reparations enforcement continued under revised schedules. Payments were made through a combination of cash transfers and in-kind deliveries. Oversight mechanisms included monitoring of railway revenues and customs receipts. Compliance reporting continued through designated administrative channels. Occupation forces remained stationed in designated Rhineland zones. Military restrictions remained in effect. Allied inspection regimes persisted, though inspection frequency declined compared to earlier years. Military administration functioned within authorized limits. The Army maintained its structure of 7 infantry divisions. Civil-military separation remained enforced. Military units did not participate in internal security operations. Police forces retained responsibility for public order. Police staffing levels increased in major urban areas. Equipment modernization proceeded through approved procurement channels. Internal security conditions improved relative to earlier years. Recorded incidents of political violence declined. Paramilitary organizations remained subject to regulation. Disarmament orders continued to be issued and enforced unevenly across regions. Political institutions operated under constitutional procedures. Parliamentary sessions addressed fiscal legislation, labor regulation, and treaty compliance. Coalition governments are formed through negotiated agreements among parliamentary parties. Cabinet changes occurred without suspension of constitutional processes. Electoral activity continued at the state and municipal levels. Voter turnout remained high relative to pre-war norms. Party representation reflected fragmentation across ideological lines. No single party secured sustained parliamentary dominance. Judicial institutions addressed a steady volume of cases related to commercial disputes, labor relations, and administrative enforcement. Courts applied statutory conversion schedules to resolve contractual claims arising from prior inflation. Legal certainty increased relative to earlier years. Foreign policy engagement expanded further. Diplomatic missions operated in major European capitals and in the United States. Germany participated in international conferences addressing economic cooperation, arms regulation, and dispute arbitration. Membership in the League of Nations provided a forum for multilateral engagement. Arbitration procedures established under international agreements were invoked in several minor disputes. Diplomatic correspondence documented ongoing negotiations over border incidents, trade access, and transit rights. Formal disputes were processed through established channels rather than unilateral action. Economic growth during 1928 remained uneven. Export industries benefited from improved access to foreign markets. Domestic consumption increased as wages stabilized. Agricultural producers faced price volatility and credit constraints, leading to regional disparities in income. Labor relations remained regulated under collective bargaining frameworks. Wage agreements were renegotiated periodically. Strike activity occurred but remained limited in scale. Government mediation mechanisms were employed to resolve industrial disputes. Social welfare programs continued to operate under statutory provisions. Unemployment insurance systems processed claims. War pensions and disability benefits were disbursed according to established schedules. Administrative capacity varied among regions. Urban infrastructure investment continued. Municipal authorities expanded public transport systems, water supply networks, and electricity generation. Housing construction addressed shortages in major cities. Funding relied on a mix of municipal bonds, bank credit, and foreign loans. Public debt levels increased. Debt servicing obligations remained manageable under prevailing economic conditions, but required sustained export earnings and fiscal discipline. Currency stability remained dependent on foreign capital inflows. Throughout 1928, the German mark maintained relative stability against major currencies. Price indices fluctuated within a narrow range. Public confidence in the currency persisted under existing monetary arrangements. In 1929, international economic conditions shifted. Capital inflows slowed during the first half of the year. Financial markets exhibited increased volatility. Short-term credit conditions tightened. German banks faced higher refinancing costs. Industrial output growth decelerated. Export orders declined in some sectors. Inventory accumulation increased as demand softened. Firms adjusted production schedules in response to changing market conditions. Government fiscal planning reflected increased uncertainty. Budget projections incorporated revised revenue estimates. Expenditure commitments, including reparations and social programs, limited fiscal flexibility. Borrowing requirements increased. Reparations administration continued without modification. Scheduled payments and deliveries proceeded under existing arrangements. Oversight mechanisms remained in force. Political debate intensified within parliamentary forums. Legislative records show increased scrutiny of economic policy, foreign borrowing, and employment trends. Opposition parties raised objections to fiscal and financial exposure. Public order conditions remained stable. Police forces continued routine operations. No suspension of civil authority occurred. Courts remained operational. By the end of 1929, Germany maintained functioning administrative institutions, stabilized currency conditions, and established diplomatic engagement while facing emerging economic pressures. Industrial output had not collapsed, but growth had slowed. Financial dependence on foreign capital remained significant. In 1929, Germany entered a period of rapid economic contraction following changes in international financial conditions. Capital inflows that had supported industrial investment, municipal finance, and currency stability during the late 1920s declined sharply. Short-term credit facilities were reduced. Refinancing costs increased for banks, firms, and public authorities. In October 1929, international equity markets experienced abrupt declines. Financial institutions in Germany faced increased withdrawal of foreign funds. Commercial banks tightened lending standards. Credit lines to industry and municipalities were curtailed. Loan renewals became less frequent. Industrial production contracted during late 1929 and early 1930. Output declines were recorded in steel, coal, machinery, and export-oriented manufacturing. Inventory accumulation increased as domestic and foreign demand weakened. Firms reduced working hours and suspended expansion projects. Employment levels fell steadily. Registered unemployment increased from approximately 1.3 million in September 1929 to over 3 million by September 1930. By early 1931, unemployment exceeded 4.5 million, representing more than 20% of the insured workforce. Short-term work arrangements expanded across industrial sectors. Public finances deteriorated. Tax revenues declined as employment and profits fell. Social expenditure increased due to unemployment benefits and welfare assistance. Budget deficits widened at the federal, state, and municipal levels. Borrowing requirements increased under constrained credit conditions. The social insurance system experienced strain. Unemployment insurance funds have depleted reserves. Contribution income declined. Benefit payments increased. Emergency financing measures were enacted to maintain payments. Benefit levels were reduced through administrative decrees. In 1930, the German government implemented fiscal consolidation measures. Expenditure reductions were ordered across ministries. Public sector wages and benefits were adjusted downward. Tax increases were enacted on consumption, income, and property. Emergency powers were invoked under constitutional provisions permitting executive action without parliamentary approval. Political institutions continued to operate under constitutional procedures, but legislative stability weakened. Parliamentary coalitions fractured over fiscal policy and social spending. Government measures were increasingly enacted through presidential decrees rather than legislative majorities. Elections held in 1930 produced significant changes in parliamentary representation. Voter turnout remained high. Parties opposing existing fiscal and political arrangements gained representation. Established governing parties lost seats. Parliamentary fragmentation increased. Public order conditions deteriorated. Demonstrations and counter-demonstrations occurred in major cities. Street clashes between rival political organizations were recorded. Police forces deployed to manage public assemblies and enforce order. Military units remained excluded from internal security operations. Industrial labor relations shifted. Wage reductions were imposed through arbitration and decree. Collective bargaining coverage narrowed. Strike activity occurred but declined as unemployment limited bargaining power. Lockouts were recorded in selected industries. Municipal governments faced insolvency. Revenues from local taxes declined sharply. Welfare expenditures increased. Infrastructure investment halted. Municipal borrowing capacity diminished. Emergency oversight mechanisms were introduced in some regions to manage fiscal collapse. Foreign trade contracted. Export volumes declined due to reduced global demand. Import volumes fell as domestic consumption contracted. Trade balances fluctuated due to price movements and currency pressures. Currency stability came under pressure. Foreign exchange reserves declined. Capital flight intensified during periods of political uncertainty. The central bank intervened to support the currency through interest rate adjustments and reserve management. In 1931, financial instability intensified. Several large banking institutions experienced liquidity crises. Deposit withdrawals increased. Interbank lending contracted. Government guarantees were issued to stabilize the banking system. In July 1931, temporary bank closures were ordered to halt withdrawals and restore confidence. Payment systems were disrupted. Commercial transactions slowed. Emergency regulations governed banking operations during the closure period. International financial assistance was sought. Short-term credit arrangements were negotiated to stabilize reserves. External conditions limited available support. Negotiations over reparations payments intensified as fiscal capacity deteriorated. In June 1931, a temporary suspension of certain reparation payments was announced through an international agreement. The suspension reduced immediate transfer obligations but did not cancel underlying liabilities. Administrative adjustments followed. Industrial output continued to decline throughout 1931. Construction activity collapsed. Agricultural producers faced falling prices and rising debt burdens. Foreclosures increased in rural areas. Credit availability for agriculture diminished. Unemployment continued to rise. By late 1931, registered unemployment approached 5 million. Relief programs expanded but remained insufficient to meet demand. Local welfare offices implemented rationing of assistance. Political violence increased. Armed confrontations between political groups occurred with greater frequency. Police forces reported rising casualties among officers and civilians. Emergency regulations expanded police authority for crowd control and detention. Judicial institutions remained operational. Courts processed cases related to bankruptcy, debt enforcement, labor disputes, and public order violations. Caseloads increased. Enforcement capacity was uneven across regions. Parliamentary sessions became increasingly contentious. Legislative productivity declined. Confidence votes failed. Governments were formed and dissolved under constitutional authority without long-term stability. Foreign diplomatic relations reflected economic distress. Trade negotiations sought market access and tariff relief. Debt negotiations addressed repayment schedules and interest obligations. Outcomes were limited by global economic conditions. Public administration continued routine operations under emergency fiscal constraints. Civil servants remained in office under reduced compensation. Administrative functions persisted despite budgetary contraction. By the end of 1931, Germany faced sustained economic contraction, high unemployment, fiscal crisis, and political fragmentation. State institutions remained in operation under constitutional authority and emergency regulations. Economic recovery had not begun. Financial stability remained fragile. In 1932, Germany remained under conditions of economic contraction, fiscal strain, and political fragmentation. Constitutional institutions continued to function formally, but governance relied increasingly on executive authority exercised through emergency powers. Presidential authority was central to state operation. Under constitutional provisions, emergency decrees regulated fiscal policy, labor relations, and public order. Parliamentary approval was not required for their issuance. Decrees addressed budgetary shortfalls, reductions in social benefits, wage adjustments, and restrictions on public expenditure. Elections were held under existing legal frameworks. In July 1932, national parliamentary elections produced significant changes in representation. Voter turnout exceeded 80%. No party secured a governing majority. Coalition formation failed. Parliamentary sessions were convened, but were unable to sustain stable legislative coalitions. Government formation proceeded through presidential appointment. Cabinets were installed without parliamentary confidence votes. Ministers exercised authority under emergency decrees. Legislative output declined as executive measures replaced parliamentary lawmaking. Public order regulations expanded. Restrictions were placed on political assemblies. Bans on paramilitary organizations were issued and revoked through executive authority. Police forces enforced public safety regulations under expanded legal powers. Arrests and detentions occurred under emergency provisions. Economic conditions remained severe. Industrial production remained depressed. Unemployment exceeded 6 million by late 1932, including registered unemployed and participants in emergency work programs. Social assistance systems operated under reduced benefit schedules. Municipal welfare offices rationed aid. Public finances remained strained. Tax revenues were insufficient to meet obligations. Expenditure reductions continued. Debt servicing absorbed a substantial share of available revenue. Borrowing capacity was limited by financial market conditions. In November 1932, further parliamentary elections were conducted. Electoral results altered party representation but did not resolve legislative fragmentation. Coalition negotiations again failed to produce a stable parliamentary government. Executive authority persisted through presidential appointment. Cabinets were reorganized. Administrative continuity was maintained across ministerial departments. Civil servants retained office under statutory law. Political violence continued. Street confrontations between organized groups occurred in major cities. Police reports documented injuries and fatalities. Emergency regulations expanded police powers for search, detention, and crowd control. Military forces remained excluded from internal security roles. Judicial institutions remained operational. Courts processed cases related to public order violations, political violence, labor disputes, and debt enforcement. Emergency regulations influenced sentencing and detention procedures. Foreign relations continued through diplomatic channels. Trade negotiations addressed tariff barriers and market access. Debt and reparations discussions continued without resolution. International financial conditions limited available relief. In January 1933, a new government was formed through presidential appointment. The head of government was selected under constitutional authority. Cabinet positions were distributed among multiple parties. Executive power remained grounded in existing legal structures. Shortly after government formation, emergency regulations governing public order were expanded. Decrees restricted civil liberties, including limitations on assembly, expression, and press activity. Enforcement authority was delegated to the police and administrative agencies. In February 1933, a major fire damaged the parliamentary building in Berlin. Emergency decrees were issued on the same day, citing threats to public safety. These decrees suspended constitutional protections related to personal liberty, communication privacy, and due process. Arrests were authorized without standard judicial oversight. Political organizations were affected by enforcement actions. Offices were closed. Publications were restricted. Political opponents were detained under emergency authority. Administrative agencies executed these measures under executive directives. In March 1933, national parliamentary elections were conducted under conditions shaped by emergency regulations. Voter turnout remained high. Electoral outcomes altered parliamentary composition but did not produce an absolute majority for any single party. Following the election, legislative procedures were used to enact a law transferring legislative authority to the executive branch. The law was passed by the parliament with the required quorum and voting thresholds under existing constitutional rules. The law authorized the executive to issue laws without parliamentary approval, including measures deviating from the Constitution. After the passage of the law, legislative activity ceased as a central mechanism of governance. Executive decrees replaced parliamentary statutes. Ministries implemented policies through administrative orders. State governments were reorganized. Regional administrations were brought under centralized control through legal and administrative measures. Elected state legislatures were dissolved or rendered inactive. Authority was transferred to appointed officials. Civil service structures remained intact. Personnel continued to operate within ministries, courts, and regulatory agencies. Loyalty oaths and personnel reviews were introduced. Administrative compliance proceeded through existing hierarchies. Police forces were expanded and reorganized. Jurisdictional authority was centralized. Detention facilities were placed under administrative control. Legal oversight was limited under emergency provisions. Judicial independence was constrained through legislative and administrative changes. Courts continued to operate, but under revised legal frameworks. Special courts were established to process designated categories of offenses. Trade unions were dissolved through administrative action. Their assets were seized. Replacement organizations were established under state supervision. Collective bargaining procedures were terminated. Labor relations were governed by administrative regulation. Political parties were dissolved or prohibited through legal measures. Party assets were confiscated. Political activity outside approved frameworks was criminalized. Elections at national and regional levels ceased to function as mechanisms of political competition. By the end of 1933, Germany operated under centralized executive authority exercised through emergency powers and enabling legislation. Parliamentary lawmaking had been replaced by decree. Constitutional protections were suspended or overridden. Administrative institutions continued to function under revised legal norms. In 1933, the German state operated under centralized executive authority exercised through emergency decrees and enabling legislation. Administrative institutions continued routine operations under revised legal norms. Legislative activity was replaced by executive order. Public administration implemented regulatory changes affecting political organizations, labor relations, media, and civil society. Decrees restricted assembly and expression. Enforcement authority was vested in the police and administrative agencies. Detention procedures operated under emergency provisions. Trade unions were dissolved during the first half of 1933. Union offices were closed by administrative order. Financial assets were seized. Labor representation was reorganized under state supervision. Collective bargaining procedures were replaced by administrative regulation of wages and working conditions. Industrial relations were governed through decrees establishing workplace oversight structures. Employer organizations and labor representatives operated within state-defined frameworks. Strikes and lockouts were prohibited. The arbitration authority was centralized. Political parties were dissolved or prohibited through legal measures. Party assets were confiscated. Political activity outside approved organizations was criminalized. Electoral competition ceased as an operative mechanism. Media regulation expanded. Newspapers and periodicals were subject to licensing requirements. Editorial content was monitored under press regulations. Publishing licenses were revoked for noncompliance. Radio broadcasting operated under centralized control. Educational institutions were reorganized through administrative orders. Curriculum standards were revised. Personnel reviews were conducted for teachers and university faculty. Appointments and dismissals followed regulatory criteria established by central authorities. Civil service administration remained intact. Ministries, courts, and regulatory agencies continued to function. Personnel records were reviewed. Loyalty declarations were introduced. Dismissals and reassignments were conducted under statutory authority. Police forces expanded in size and jurisdiction. Command structures were centralized. Preventive detention authority was broadened. Detention facilities are operated under administrative control. Oversight mechanisms were limited under emergency provisions. Judicial institutions continued to operate under revised legal frameworks. Special courts were established to process designated categories of offenses. Procedural safeguards were modified through decree. Appeals processes were restricted in specified cases. In 1933, economic policy emphasized employment programs and public works. Infrastructure projects were initiated under central planning. Funding was allocated through budgetary decrees. Employment statistics reflected increased participation in state-directed labor programs. Fiscal administration adjusted to expanded spending. Budgetary authority was exercised through executive decree. Tax policy was modified to support revenue collection. Public debt levels increased as borrowing expanded. Military administration remained subject to treaty constraints. Armed forces continued to operate at authorized strength levels. Training activities proceeded within permitted categories. Equipment inventories complied with existing restrictions. Inspection regimes continued under international supervision. Foreign policy activity emphasized diplomatic engagement and treaty revision through negotiation. Diplomatic missions operated in major capitals. Communications addressed compliance disputes, inspection procedures, and delivery schedules. In October 1933, Germany announced its withdrawal from a multilateral organization concerned with arms regulation and collective security. Formal notification was issued in accordance with procedural requirements. Diplomatic correspondence followed with signatory states. Military planning authority remained administratively constrained. The general staff remained formally prohibited. Military offices operated under designated administrative titles. Training programs emphasized command procedure and discipline within authorized structures. Economic indicators during 1933 showed mixed results. Industrial production increased in selected sectors associated with public works. Consumer goods production remained constrained. Agricultural output fluctuated due to price controls and procurement policies. Price regulation expanded. Administrative agencies set price ceilings for essential goods. Enforcement varied by region. Supply shortages occurred intermittently. Distribution controls were applied to selected commodities. By late 1933, centralized control over political, labor, and media institutions was established through legal and administrative mechanisms. State authority operated through decree. Civil administration executed directives through existing bureaucratic channels. In 1934, further consolidation occurred. State governments were reorganized. Regional legislative bodies were dissolved or rendered inactive. Authority was transferred to appointed officials operating under central directives. Administrative integration proceeded through statutory measures. Police and security agencies were reorganized. Jurisdictional authority was clarified through regulation. The detention authority was expanded. Internal security operations were conducted under centralized command. Judicial administration adjusted to revised legal frameworks. Courts continued to process civil and criminal cases. Special jurisdictions handled offenses defined by decree. Legal procedures reflected statutory modifications. Labor administration expanded oversight of workplaces. Employment conditions were regulated by administrative order. Wage scales and working hours were set through centralized directives. Workplace organizations operated under state supervision. Economic policy in 1934 emphasized production targets and employment stabilization. Industrial firms received contracts linked to public works and state procurement. Infrastructure projects continued. Transportation and construction sectors expanded. Fiscal policy supported increased expenditure. Budgetary allocations were issued by decree. Revenue collection remained constrained. Borrowing increased to finance programs. Debt instruments were issued under state authority. Foreign relations continued through bilateral diplomacy. Negotiations addressed inspection regimes, disarmament provisions, and treaty compliance. Diplomatic communications documented disputes over verification procedures and timelines. In June 1934, security operations were conducted against selected political and paramilitary groups. Arrests and detentions occurred. Organizational leadership was removed. Administrative control over security agencies was reinforced. Following these operations, command structures within security and police organizations were consolidated. Jurisdictional authority was clarified through a decree. Internal reporting lines were revised. In August 1934, executive authority was further consolidated through legal measures following a change in the head of state. Offices were combined under statutory provisions. Oaths of service were administered to military and civil personnel under revised authority structures. Military administration adjusted to revised command arrangements. Personnel procedures were updated. Training continued under existing constraints. Organizational continuity was maintained within administrative limits. Foreign policy communications addressed leadership changes through formal diplomatic channels. Recognition procedures were conducted in accordance with international practice. By the end of 1934, Germany operated under centralized executive authority with integrated control over political, labor, security, and administrative institutions. Legal mechanisms provided the basis for governance. Public administration continued routine functions under revised statutory norms. In 1935, the German state initiated formal changes to military policy through legal and administrative measures enacted by executive authority. These measures altered force structure, personnel policy, and armament regulation under centralized control. On March 16, 1935, a law reintroduced compulsory military service. The law established a peacetime strength of 36 divisions for the Army. Personnel ceilings were expanded beyond previous treaty limits. Administrative offices were directed to implement registration, induction, and training procedures. Conscription schedules were published through official channels. Simultaneously, the existence of an air force was publicly declared. Aviation units were organized under centralized command. Personnel recruitment proceeded through voluntary enlistment and transfer from civilian aviation sectors. Aircraft production expanded under state contracts. Training facilities were established at designated airfields. Naval construction programs were announced. Shipbuilding contracts were issued to domestic yards. Tonnage limits specified by earlier agreements were exceeded through revised classification and construction schedules. Procurement orders covered surface vessels and submarines. Military administration expanded. Personnel departments processed and increased enlistment. Training commands revised curricula to accommodate larger intakes. Officer promotion schedules were adjusted. Command hierarchies were reorganized under expanded force structures. Industrial mobilization accelerated. Armaments production increased across sectors, including steel, chemicals, explosives, vehicles, and aircraft. State procurement contracts specified delivery targets and timelines. Industrial firms expanded capacity through new facilities and workforce increases. Employment levels rose in armaments-related industries. Skilled labor demand increased. Vocational training programs expanded under state supervision. Wage regulation remained under administrative authority. Fiscal policy supported military expansion. Budgetary allocations increased for defense procurement. Financing relied on a combination of state borrowing, special credit instruments, and budgetary transfers. Public debt expanded. Off-budget financing mechanisms were employed to support procurement without full parliamentary accounting. Foreign reactions followed the announcement of conscription and force expansion. Diplomatic protests were issued by multiple governments. Formal notes cited violations of existing agreements. Germany responded through diplomatic correspondence, asserting sovereign authority to enact defense legislation. In June 1935, Germany concluded a bilateral naval agreement with the United Kingdom. The agreement set ratios for naval tonnage between the two states. Submarine construction was authorized within specified limits. The agreement was signed through diplomatic channels and entered into force upon ratification. Naval administration adjusted procurement plans to align with the agreement's provisions. Shipyard schedules were revised. Naval personnel recruitment expanded. Training commands incorporated new vessel classes into instruction programs. The Air Force organization continued. Aircraft production increased in 1935 to 1936. Fighter, bomber, and transport aircraft entered service. Training hours expanded. Airfield construction proceeded across multiple regions. Logistics and maintenance units were formed to support operational readiness. Ground forces expanded through successive induction cycles. Training camps operated continuously. Equipment procurement included small arms, artillery, vehicles, and communication systems. Standardization of equipment proceeded under centralized specifications. In 1936, further military action occurred through territorial deployment. On March 7, 1936, German military units entered the Rhineland zone. The deployment was conducted under orders issued by the executive authority. Units consisted primarily of infantry and support elements. Movement occurred along designated routes. Occupation authorities previously stationed in the zone did not engage militarily. German units established positions in urban centers and transport hubs. Civil administration resumed control over public buildings and infrastructure. Police forces coordinated with military units to manage public order. Military units were instructed to avoid engagement and withdraw if confronted by a superior force. Communications between field units and central command were maintained throughout the operation. No armed clashes occurred. Diplomatic responses followed. Governments issued formal protests. Consultations occurred through diplomatic channels. No military countermeasures were undertaken by foreign forces. Negotiations were proposed through international forums. Following the Rhineland deployment, military construction commenced. Fortifications were planned and built. Infrastructure projects included roads, bridges, and defensive positions. Engineering units carried out surveys and construction tasks. Military budgets expanded further. Procurement contracts increased in volume. Industrial output related to defense continued to rise. Employment in the construction and armaments industries expanded accordingly. Civil administration supported military programs. Transportation ministries coordinated rail and road logistics. Labor authorities managed workforce allocation. Education and training institutions expanded technical programs relevant to defense production. Currency and price controls remained in effect. Administrative agencies regulated raw material distribution. Import substitution policies were applied to strategic materials. Synthetic production programs expanded for fuel and rubber substitutes. Foreign policy activity continued alongside military measures. Diplomatic missions engaged in negotiations addressing arms regulation, border security, and treaty obligations. Proposals for non-aggression and arbitration were exchanged. Formal agreements were limited. International conferences addressed security concerns. German representatives participated or withdrew according to procedural decisions. Communications documented disagreements over enforcement mechanisms and verification procedures. By late 1936, military expansion had altered force composition, industrial allocation, and administrative priorities. Armed forces operated under expanded personnel ceilings. Production targets continued to rise. Training pipelines were established for sustained growth. Public administration adjusted to expanded defense activity. Ministries issued regulations coordinating industrial output, labor allocation, and transportation. Oversight agencies monitored compliance with production schedules. Legal authority for military expansion remained grounded in executive decrees and enabling legislation. Parliamentary lawmaking did not resume as a primary mechanism for defense policy. Administrative orders governed implementation. Foreign diplomatic engagement persisted. No formal military alliances were concluded during this period beyond existing bilateral agreements. Diplomatic correspondence continued to address concerns over security and compliance. By the end of 1936, Germany maintained expanded armed forces, increased armaments production, and restored military presence in previously restricted zones. State institutions operated under centralized authority directing military, industrial, and administrative activity. In 1937, Germany continued military expansion and administrative consolidation under centralized executive authority. Armed forces, industrial production, and state planning operated under coordinated directives issued through executive decree and ministerial regulation. Military force structure expanded further. Army units increased in number and readiness. Training cycles accelerated. Officer promotion schedules were revised to accommodate expanded formations. Equipment procurement continued across infantry, artillery, armored vehicles, and communications systems. Standardization programs aligned production with operational requirements. Air Force expansion proceeded. Aircraft output increased across fighter, bomber, and reconnaissance categories. Training commands expanded flight hours. New airfields were completed. Maintenance depots and logistics units were established to support increased operational tempo. Naval construction continued under approved tonnage ratios. Surface vessels entered service. Submarine production expanded within revised limits. Shipyard employment increased. Naval training programs adjusted to incorporate new platforms. Industrial output rose in armaments, steel, chemicals, and vehicle manufacturing. State contracts specified delivery quotas and deadlines. Raw material allocation was regulated through administrative controls. Import substitution programs expanded for fuel, rubber, and strategic metals. Employment increased in defense-related sectors. Labor allocation agencies directed skilled workers to priority industries. Vocational training programs expanded. Wage regulation remained under administrative authority. Fiscal policy supported continued expansion. Defense expenditure increased as a proportion of total state spending. Financing relied on borrowing, special credit instruments, and controlled budgetary transfers. Public debt levels rose. Monetary controls remained in effect. Foreign policy activity continued alongside military growth. Diplomatic missions engaged in negotiations addressing security concerns, arms regulation, and treaty compliance. Communications documented objections from foreign governments regarding force expansion and armament programs. Responses were issued through formal diplomatic channels. In November 1937, senior military and political officials convened to review strategic planning and force readiness. Records document discussion of force development timelines, industrial capacity, and contingency planning. No formal declarations were issued following the meeting. Administrative implementation continued under existing directives. Throughout 1937, territorial and political questions remained unresolved. Border issues in Central Europe continued to generate diplomatic activity. Minority protections and treaty obligations were addressed through bilateral discussions. Arbitration mechanisms were referenced in diplomatic correspondence. Economic indicators during 1937 reflected sustained industrial growth. Output levels in armaments and heavy industry increased. Consumer goods production remained constrained by resource allocation. Price controls remained in effect. Supply shortages persisted in selected commodities. Public administration continued to operate under centralized authority. Ministries issued regulations coordinating industrial output, transportation, and labor allocation. Oversight agencies monitored compliance with production targets and distribution controls. Judicial institutions continued to function under revised legal frameworks. Courts processed civil and criminal cases under statutory law and special jurisdiction provisions. Administrative courts reviewed regulatory enforcement actions. Police and security agencies maintained expanded authority. Public order regulations remained in force. Preventive detention authority continued under the executive decree. Oversight mechanisms remained limited. In March 1938, German military forces entered Austria following political developments in that state. Troop movements occurred without organized resistance. Administrative integration followed through legal measures enacted by the executive authority. State institutions in Austria were reorganized under centralized control. Following incorporation, administrative structures were aligned with existing German institutions. Civil service personnel were integrated. Legal systems were harmonized through decrees. Police and security forces were reorganized under centralized command. Economic integration followed. Banking systems were merged. Currency conversion was implemented. Industrial assets were placed under state supervision. Labor allocation agencies extended authority over the incorporated territory. Military administration expanded force recruitment. Personnel from the incorporated territory were registered for service. Training programs absorbed recruits. Infrastructure assets were incorporated into military planning. Foreign diplomatic responses followed the incorporation. Formal protests were issued by several governments. No military intervention occurred. Diplomatic correspondence documented objections and expressions of concern. Negotiations did not result in a reversal. Later in 1938, territorial claims regarding regions with German-speaking populations intensified. Diplomatic negotiations addressed border adjustments and minority protections. International conferences were convened to address these issues. In September 1938, agreements were concluded altering territorial control in Central Europe. The agreements transferred specified regions to German administration. Implementation followed through military occupation and administrative integration. Military units entered designated territories without organized resistance. Civil administration assumed control of government facilities, transportation infrastructure, and communication systems. Police forces enforced public order. Legal authority was established through executive decrees. Economic administration extended controls over newly acquired territories. Industrial assets, mines, and transportation systems were integrated into existing planning frameworks. Labor allocation extended to the new regions. Currency and price regulations were applied. Military planning adjusted to expanded territorial responsibilities. Defensive positions were surveyed. Infrastructure projects were initiated. Logistics networks were extended. Training commands incorporated new geographic considerations. Foreign diplomatic activity continued. Formal guarantees were issued regarding the remaining borders. Diplomatic correspondence recorded assurances and reservations. No immediate military escalation followed. Throughout 1938, military readiness increased. Force levels expanded. Training cycles continued without interruption. Armaments production reached higher output levels. Industrial capacity remained under centralized direction. Public administration maintained centralized control. Ministries coordinated expanded territorial governance. Regulatory enforcement extended across the enlarged state. Civil service operations continued under revised jurisdiction. Fiscal administration adjusted to expanded expenditure and revenue bases. Tax systems were extended to incorporated territories. Budgetary allocations increased to support infrastructure and security. Debt issuance continued to finance expansion. Public order remained under police and security supervision. Preventive detention authority continued. Political opposition was restricted through administrative measures. Courts operated under revised legal frameworks. By the end of 1938, Germany controlled an expanded territory, maintained enlarged armed forces, and operated an economy oriented towards sustained military readiness. Diplomatic agreements had altered borders without a general war. Military deployment and administrative integration proceeded through legal and executive mechanisms. In 1939, Germany operated with expanded armed forces, centralized executive authority, and an economy oriented towards sustained military activity. Administrative institutions functioned under established, decree-based governance. Diplomatic engagement continued alongside military preparation. Military mobilization intensified during the first half of the year. Personnel intake expanded through successive conscription classes. Training establishments operated continuously. Equipment deliveries increased across infantry, armored, artillery, and aviation categories. Logistics units expanded transport and supply capacity. Industrial production remained focused on armaments and support equipment. Steel output increased. Explosives and munitions production expanded. Vehicle manufacturing prioritized military requirements. Aircraft assembly lines operated at an increased tempo. Labor allocation agencies directed skilled workers to priority facilities. Fiscal administration supported increased expenditure. Defense budgets expanded through executive authorization. Borrowing continued through state credit instruments. Monetary controls regulated currency circulation and price stability. Rationing plans were prepared by administrative agencies. Foreign policy activity continued through bilateral and multilateral channels. Diplomatic missions engaged in negotiations addressing territorial claims, security arrangements, and treaty obligations. Communications documented demands, counterproposals, and guarantees. In March 1939, German forces entered the remaining Czech territories following political developments in the region. Military units occupied Prague and the surrounding areas. Administrative authority was assumed through executive decrees. Civil institutions were reorganized under centralized control. The occupation extended German control over industrial assets, transportation networks, and armaments facilities. Administrative agencies assumed management authority. Currency controls and fiscal regulations were imposed. Labor allocation extended to the occupied territories. Foreign diplomatic reactions followed. Formal protests were issued by multiple governments. Diplomatic correspondence recorded objections. No military intervention occurred. During spring and summer 1939, military planning addressed Eastern territorial questions. Diplomatic communications intensified regarding border arrangements and security guarantees. Negotiations were conducted through ambassadors and special envoys. On August 23, 1939, Germany concluded a bilateral non-aggression agreement with the Soviet Union. The treaty included provisions for neutrality and consultation. Additional protocols addressed spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. The agreement entered into force upon signature. Following the agreement, military preparations accelerated. Mobilization orders were issued to designated units. Troop concentrations increased along the eastern frontiers. Transport schedules coordinated the rail movement of personnel and equipment. Supply depots were stocked with fuel, ammunition, and provisions. Naval forces received operational orders. Submarine flotillas are prepared for deployment. Surface vessels repositioned according to operational plans. Maritime logistics coordinated fuel and maintenance requirements. Air Force units increased readiness. Aircraft were dispersed to operational airfields. Training transitioned to operational deployment. Maintenance units are prepared for sustained sortie operations. Civil defense measures were implemented. Air raid precautions were introduced in urban areas. Blackout regulations were enforced. Emergency services are prepared for a potential attack. Administrative agencies issued public instructions through official channels. Diplomatic activity continued during mobilization. Communications addressed guarantees issued by foreign powers to states in Eastern Europe. Formal notes were exchanged. Negotiations did not produce a resolution. On September 1st, 1939, German armed forces commenced military operations against Poland. Ground forces crossed the border at multiple points. Air units conducted coordinated operations against military and infrastructure targets. Naval units executed blockade and patrol missions. Military operations proceeded under centralized command. Armored formations advanced rapidly. Infantry units followed established axes of movement. Air support coordinated with ground operations. Communications networks maintained command and control. Polish military resistance was encountered. Engagements occurred across multiple regions. Civilian administration in the occupied areas was displaced. Military authorities assumed control of transportation hubs, communication facilities, and government buildings. On September 3, 1939, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany following the initiation of hostilities in Poland. Diplomatic notifications were delivered through established channels. Germany entered a state of war with multiple major powers. Military command structures adjusted to expanded conflict. Western Front units implemented defensive deployments. Border fortifications were manned. Mobilization expanded to additional classes. Industrial production schedules were revised to reflect wartime requirements. Naval operations expanded following declarations of war. Submarine operations commenced against enemy shipping. Surface units deployed according to operational directives. Naval logistics supported sustained operations. Air operations expanded. Reconnaissance flights increased. Defensive measures were implemented to counter potential air attacks. Anti-aircraft defenses were activated in urban and industrial areas. Civil administration adjusted to wartime conditions. Emergency regulations governed labor allocation, transportation priority, and resource distribution. Rationing systems were implemented for selected commodities. Price controls were enforced. Economic management shifted to wartime footing. Industrial output was reallocated to military production. Civilian consumption was restricted. Import and export controls were tightened. Foreign exchange regulations limited capital movement. Legal authority for wartime measures was exercised through executive decrees. Courts continued to operate under revised procedures. Police and security agencies expanded their enforcement authority. Detention and surveillance measures increased. In mid-September 1939, Soviet forces entered eastern Poland pursuant to previously agreed arrangements. German and Soviet military units coordinated demarcation lines. Military administration adjusted occupation zones accordingly. By late September 1939, organized Polish resistance had diminished. Military units secured major cities and transportation routes. Administrative authorities began establishing governance structures in occupied areas. Civil administration was reorganized under military supervision. In 1940, Germany conducted large-scale military operations across Western and Northern Europe while maintaining centralized wartime administration and industrial mobilization. Armed forces operated under unified command. Civil administration functioned under emergency regulation. Industrial output prioritized military requirements. Military operations expanded in April 1940. On April 9th, German forces initiated operations against Denmark and Norway. Naval units, airborne troops, and ground formations were deployed simultaneously. Danish authorities capitulated within hours. Norwegian resistance continued in multiple regions. Naval engagements occurred along the Norwegian coast. Air units supported landings and ground advances. By June 1940, organized resistance in Norway ceased. Military and civil administrations were established. Operations in Scandinavia secured access to northern ports, sea routes, and industrial resources. Naval and air bases were developed. Occupation forces were stationed. Administrative authority was exercised through military commands and civilian agencies operating under wartime directives. In May 1940, German forces initiated a major offensive in Western Europe. On May 10th, ground and air units advanced into the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Airborne operations targeted bridges, airfields, and communication centers. Armored formations advanced through the Ardennes region. Dutch resistance ended on May 15, 1940, following military action and government capitulation. Belgian forces continued fighting until May 28, when they surrendered. Military units secured ports, transportation hubs, and industrial centers. Armored forces advanced toward the English Channel. Communications and logistics supported rapid movement. Allied forces were encircled in northern France and Belgium. Evacuation operations removed large numbers of Allied personnel across the Channel during late May and early June. German forces continued operations into France. Paris was entered on June 14, 1940. French government authorities relocated. Military engagements continued along multiple fronts. On June 22, 1940, an armistice was signed. France was divided into occupied and unoccupied zones. Military occupation forces were deployed. Civil administration continued under occupation regulations. Military success altered force deployment and command arrangements. Units were redeployed. Training schedules were revised. Equipment maintenance and replacement were conducted. Armored and air units underwent reorganization following sustained operations. Naval operations continued. Submarine deployments expanded in the Atlantic. Surface units conducted patrols and escort missions. Naval logistics supported extended operations from bases in Northern Europe. Air operations intensified. Fighter and bomber units conducted sustained sorties. Aircraft production increased to replace combat losses. Training programs expanded for pilots and ground crews. Airfield construction and expansion continued. Industrial production operated at wartime levels. Armaments factories increased the output of tanks, artillery, aircraft, and munitions. Steel production remained high. Chemical plants produced explosives and synthetic fuels. Vehicle manufacturing focused on military transport. Labor allocation expanded. Workers were directed to priority industries. Training programs prepared skilled labor for armaments production. Wage regulation and labor discipline were enforced through administrative orders. Fiscal administration supported wartime expenditure. Defense spending increased. Borrowing expanded through state credit instruments. Monetary controls regulated currency circulation. Price controls and rationing systems expanded. Civil administration adapted to occupation responsibilities. Military governors oversaw occupied territories. Civil agencies managed transportation, utilities, and public services. Police forces enforced public order. Courts operated under occupation regulations. Foreign diplomatic activity continued in limited form. Neutral states maintained diplomatic missions. Negotiations addressed trade, transit, and neutrality arrangements. Communications with adversary states were limited to formal channels. In July 1940, military planning addressed operations against the United Kingdom. Air and naval forces prepared for sustained operations. Aircraft deployments increased in northern France and the Low Countries. Naval units adjusted patrol areas. Invasion planning proceeded within military commands. Air operations against Britain commenced during the summer. Bomber and fighter units conducted large-scale sorties. Air defense engagements occurred over southern England and the Channel. Aircraft losses increased on both sides. Industrial production adjusted to replace losses. Naval operations supported air activity. Submarine operations targeted shipping. Mine warfare expanded. Surface units conducted limited operations due to operational constraints. Civil defense measures expanded within Germany. Air raid warnings, blackout enforcement, and emergency services operated in urban areas. Industrial facilities implemented protective measures. Civilian transportation and work schedules adjusted to security regulations. Military command assessed operational outcomes through internal reporting. Force readiness was reviewed. Equipment replacement schedules were updated. Training cycles continued without interruption. Occupation administration expanded in Western Europe. Economic resources were integrated into German wartime planning. Industrial facilities were placed under supervision. Transportation networks were coordinated. Labor resources were assessed and allocated. Security operations continued in the occupied territories. Police and military units enforced regulations. Resistance activity was monitored. Detentions occurred under the occupation authority. Judicial procedures operated under revised frameworks. In September 1940, Germany concluded a tripartite agreement with Italy and Japan. The agreement addressed mutual consultation and assistance. Diplomatic notifications were issued. The agreement entered into force through formal ratification. Military coordination with allied states increased. Planning conferences addressed operational coordination and logistics. Exchange of liaison officers occurred. Industrial cooperation expanded in selected sectors. Naval and air operations continued into late 1940. Submarine deployments intensified. Air raids against British targets expanded in scale. Anti-aircraft defenses operated continuously. Aircraft production and pilot training expanded further. Economic management continued under wartime regulation. Rationing systems covered food, fuel, and raw materials. Import controls limited civilian consumption. Export arrangements with neutral states supported resource acquisition. Administrative institutions remained operational under centralized authority. Ministries coordinated war production, labor allocation, transportation, and security. Courts continued to function under emergency procedures. Police and security agencies exercised expanded authority. By the end of 1940, Germany had defeated or occupied multiple European states and maintained sustained military operations against remaining adversaries. Armed forces operated across multiple theaters. Industrial production supported continuous combat operations. Civil administration functioned under wartime regulation and occupation responsibilities. In 1941, Germany conducted the largest military operation in its history while maintaining centralized wartime administration and industrial mobilization. Armed forces operated under unified command. Civil administration functioned under emergency regulation. Industrial output remained directed toward military requirements. Military planning intensified during the first half of the year. Force concentrations increased along the eastern borders. Rail transport schedules coordinated the movement of personnel, vehicles, artillery, and supplies. Depots accumulated fuel, ammunition, and provisions. Training cycles focused on large-scale combined arms operations. Ground forces assembled in multiple army groups. Armored divisions, infantry divisions, and motorized units were deployed along extended front lines. Air units repositioned to forward airfields. Reconnaissance activity increased. Communications networks expanded to support operational command. Naval forces adjusted deployments. Submarine operations continued in the Atlantic. Surface units maintained patrol and escort missions. Naval resources were allocated to support ongoing maritime operations while preparing for expanded conflict. Industrial production operated at wartime capacity. Armaments factories produced tanks, artillery, small arms, and munitions in increasing quantities. Aircraft production expanded across fighter, bomber, and transport categories. Vehicle manufacturing prioritized military transport. Chemical plants increased the output of fuel substitutes, explosives, and lubricants. Labor allocation intensified. Workers were directed to priority industries. Training programs expanded for skilled labor. Wage regulation and labor discipline continued under administrative authority. Foreign labor utilization expanded under regulatory frameworks. Fiscal administration supported increased expenditure. Defense budgets expanded through executive authorization. Borrowing continued through state credit instruments. Monetary controls regulated currency circulation. Rationing systems expanded to additional commodities. Foreign policy activity continued alongside military preparation. Diplomatic missions engaged in communications addressing neutrality, transit rights, and economic exchange. Trade arrangements with neutral states continued under controlled conditions. In June 1941, final operational orders were issued for large-scale Eastern operations. Units received movement schedules. Air Force commands prepared coordinated strikes against airfields, infrastructure, and military targets. Logistics units completed the forward positioning of supplies. On June 22, 1941, German armed forces initiated military operations against the Soviet Union. Ground forces crossed the border along multiple axes. Air units conducted extensive strikes against airfields, command centers, and transportation infrastructure. Naval units operated in northern and Baltic waters. Operations advanced rapidly during the initial phase. Armored formations penetrated deep into the territory. Infantry units secured rear areas and supply routes. Air superiority was established over large sectors. Communications networks maintained operational control. Soviet military resistance was encountered across the front. Engagements occurred on land and in the air. Large encirclement operations developed as German units advanced. Captured equipment and supplies were documented by military authorities. Military administration followed advancing units. Field commands established control over occupied areas. Transportation hubs, communication facilities, and government buildings were secured. Military governance structures were implemented. Security operations accompanied military advances. Police and security units followed combat formations. Detention and enforcement measures were implemented under wartime authority. Administrative regulations governed movement, labor, and resource control in occupied areas. Industrial assets encountered during advances were assessed. Facilities were placed under military supervision. Machinery, raw materials, and infrastructure were cataloged. Transportation networks were integrated into logistics planning. Air operations continued at high tempo. Bomber and ground attack units supported advancing forces. Fighter units maintained air cover. Aircraft losses were replaced through accelerated production and training programs. Naval operations continued in parallel theaters. Submarine deployments intensified against maritime traffic. Naval logistics supported extended operations. Surface units maintained patrols and escort duties. Civil administration within Germany adjusted to the expanded war scope. Emergency regulations governed labor allocation, transportation priority, and resource distribution. Rationing expanded. Civil defense measures continued in urban and industrial areas. Economic management shifted further toward total war requirements. Civilian production was reduced in favor of military output. Import and export controls tightened. Foreign exchange regulations limited capital movement. As operations continued through July and August 1941, German forces advanced toward major urban and industrial centers. Supply lines lengthened. Logistics units expanded transport capacity. Maintenance and repair operations increased for vehicles and equipment. Combat intensity increased. Resistance stiffened in several sectors. Casualty figures rose. Replacement units were moved forward. Training depots accelerated the preparation of new personnel. Military planning adjusted to evolving conditions. Command directives addressed force redistribution, supply priorities, and operational objectives. Engineering units repaired infrastructure to support movement and supply. Security operations expanded in the occupied territories. Administrative controls regulated population movement, labor utilization, and resource extraction. Police and security agencies enforced regulations under military authority. Industrial production continued to increase within Germany. Armaments output reached new highs. Aircraft production expanded further. Tank and artillery manufacturing accelerated. Chemical production supported fuel and ammunition needs. Labor shortages intensified. Additional labor sources were mobilized. Administrative agencies coordinated transfers. Housing and sustenance arrangements were implemented for relocated labor forces. Fiscal policy continued to support military expenditure. Budgetary allocations increased. Borrowing expanded. Monetary controls remained in effect. Price regulation intensified to manage shortages. Foreign diplomatic engagement narrowed. Neutral states maintained limited economic and diplomatic contacts. Communications addressed trade, transit, and humanitarian issues. Formal relations with adversary states were defined by hostilities. By September 1941, German forces had advanced deep into Soviet territory. Major battles continued. Operational pauses occurred to reorganize forces and address supply constraints. Weather conditions began to affect movement and logistics. Air operations adjusted to extended distances. Forward airfields were expanded. Maintenance demands increased. Aircraft attrition required continued production and training expansion. Naval operations persisted. Submarine activity continued in the Atlantic and Arctic routes. Naval coordination addressed convoy interception and maritime logistics. Civilian conditions within Germany reflected sustained war. Rationing levels were adjusted. Work schedules intensified. Transportation prioritized military needs. Civil defense procedures remained in effect. Military command structures continued to issue directives addressing operational priorities, resource allocation, and personnel management. Training cycles for replacements continued without interruption. By the end of 1941, Germany remained engaged in extensive military operations across a vast eastern theater while sustaining operations in other regions. Armed forces operated under continuous combat conditions. Industrial and administrative systems functioned under emergency regulation and expanded military demand. In 1942, Germany continued large-scale military operations across multiple theaters while sustaining centralized wartime administration and industrial mobilization. Armed forces operated under continuous combat conditions. Civil administration functioned under emergency regulation. Industrial output remained directed toward military requirements. Military operations during the winter of 1941 to 1942 extended across the Eastern Front. Units conducted defensive actions, counteroffensives, and reorganization under severe weather conditions. Supply lines were strained by distance, infrastructure damage, and climatic factors. Equipment losses required increased maintenance and replacement. Force reconstitution proceeded through accelerated training programs. Replacement personnel were dispatched from training depots. Officer assignments were adjusted. Unit strengths varied across formations. Command structures issued revised operational directives reflecting changing conditions. In the spring of 1942, operational planning addressed renewed offensive action. Force concentrations were adjusted. Armored and motorized units were reinforced. Artillery and air support assets were repositioned. Logistics commands coordinated rail and road transport for redeployment. Industrial production expanded further. Armaments factories increased the output of tanks, artillery, munitions, and small arms. Aircraft production continued to rise across fighter, bomber, and transport categories. Vehicle manufacturing prioritized military transport. Chemical production supported fuel, explosives, and lubricants. Labor allocation intensified. Workers were directed to priority industries. Training programs expanded for skilled labor. Administrative agencies coordinated workforce transfers. Housing and sustenance arrangements were implemented for relocated labor forces. Foreign labor utilization expanded under regulatory frameworks. Civilian labor from occupied territories was incorporated into industrial production. Administrative oversight governed recruitment, transport, and assignment. Labor discipline was enforced through regulation. Fiscal administration supported sustained military expenditure. Defense budgets expanded through executive authorization. Borrowing continued through state credit instruments. Monetary controls regulated currency circulation. Price controls and rationing systems expanded to manage shortages. Military operations intensified during the summer of 1942. German forces initiated major offensives towards southern objectives in the Eastern Theater. Armored and infantry units advanced along extended axes. Air units supported ground operations through sustained sorties. Logistics demands have increased. Fuel consumption rose sharply. Supply depots were established closer to the front lines. Engineering units repaired railways and roads. Transport capacity remained under strain due to distance and infrastructure damage. Naval operations continued across multiple theaters. Submarine deployments intensified against maritime traffic. Naval logistics supported extended operations. Surface units conducted patrols, escort missions, and limited engagements. Air operations expanded. Bomber and ground attack units supported land offensives. Fighter units provided air cover. Aircraft losses increased. Replacement rates depended on production output and pilot training capacity. Security operations expanded in the occupied territories. Police and security agencies enforced regulations governing movement, labor, and resource control. Detention facilities are operated under administrative authority. Judicial procedures functioned under wartime regulations. Civil administration within Germany adjusted to a prolonged war. Emergency regulations governed labor allocation, transportation priority, and resource distribution. Rationing levels were adjusted. Civil defense measures continued in urban and industrial areas. Economic management shifted further towards sustained war production. Civilian goods production declined. Import and export controls tightened. Foreign exchange regulations limited capital movement. Strategic material allocation prioritized military use. As operations continued through mid-1942, operational outcomes varied by sector. Advances occurred in some regions. Resistance intensified in others. Casualty figures increased. Medical services expanded capacity. Replacement flows continued. Military command structures issued directives addressing operational priorities, force redistribution, and resource allocation. Planning documents reflected adjustments to objectives and timelines. Training cycles for replacements continued without interruption. In late summer 1942, major engagements occurred along extended fronts. Combat intensity increased. Supply constraints affected operational tempo. Equipment attrition required accelerated replacement. Maintenance and repair units operated continuously. Industrial output remained high but faced constraints. Raw material shortages emerged. Transportation bottlenecks affected distribution. Administrative agencies implemented allocation controls for steel, fuel, and other strategic materials. Labor shortages intensified. Additional labor sources were mobilized. Administrative measures expanded recruitment from occupied territories. Workforce management became increasingly centralized. Fiscal pressures increased. Budgetary allocations rose. Borrowing expanded. Debt instruments were issued under state authority. Monetary controls remained in effect. Price regulation intensified to manage inflationary pressures. Foreign diplomatic engagement remained limited. Neutral states maintained constrained economic relations. Communications addressed trade, transit, and humanitarian issues. Formal relations with adversary states remained defined by hostilities. Military operations extended into the autumn of 1942. Prolonged engagements strained personnel and equipment. Weather conditions affected mobility. Supply requirements increased. Operational pauses occurred to reorganize units. Air operations adjusted to changing conditions. Forward airfields were expanded. Maintenance demands increased. Training programs accelerated to replace losses. Naval operations persisted. Submarine activity continued against maritime traffic. Naval coordination addressed convoy interception and logistics support. Civilian conditions within Germany reflected sustained strain. Rationing tightened for selected commodities. Work schedules intensified. Transportation prioritized military needs. Civil defense procedures remained in effect. Administrative institutions continued to operate under centralized authority. Ministries coordinated production, labor, logistics, and security. Courts functioned under wartime procedures. Police and security agencies exercised expanded enforcement authority. By the end of 1942, Germany remained engaged in extensive military operations under conditions of increasing strain. Armed forces operated across vast theaters with sustained losses. Industrial and administrative systems continued to function under emergency regulation and expanded military demand. In 1943, Germany conducted military operations under conditions of sustained material loss, manpower depletion, and intensified pressure across multiple theaters. Armed forces operated in continuous combat. Civil administration functioned under expanded emergency regulation. Industrial production remained directed toward military requirements amid increasing constraints. Military operations in the Eastern Theater intensified during the winter of 1942 to 1943. Encircled German forces in the southern sector ceased organized resistance in February 1943 following prolonged combat and supply exhaustion. Personnel losses were extensive. Equipment losses included tanks, artillery, vehicles, and aircraft. Command structures were reorganized following the conclusion of operations. Force reconstitution followed through accelerated mobilization. Replacement personnel were drawn from training depots, reserve formations, and newly inducted age cohorts. Officer reassignment occurred across units. Training cycles were shortened. Unit strengths varied significantly across formations. In spring 1943, military planning addressed stabilization of front lines and preparation for renewed operations. Defensive positions were reinforced. Engineering units constructed fortifications, trenches, and obstacles. Logistics commands coordinated supply redistribution to address depleted stocks. Industrial production increased further despite constraints. Armaments factories expanded output of tanks, artillery, and munitions. Aircraft production continued to rise, with emphasis on fighter aircraft. Vehicle manufacturing prioritized replacement of combat losses. Chemical production supported fuel, explosives, and lubricants. Labor allocation intensified. Skilled workers were reassigned to priority facilities. Training programs expanded for technical roles. Administrative agencies coordinated workforce transfers across regions. Housing and provisioning arrangements were implemented for the relocated labor force. Foreign labor utilization expanded further. Civilian labor from occupied territories was incorporated into industrial and agricultural production under administrative supervision. Recruitment, transport, and assignment were regulated by central authorities. Enforcement mechanisms governed labor discipline. Fiscal administration supported sustained military expenditure. Defense budgets expanded through executive authorization. Borrowing continued through state credit instruments. Monetary controls regulated currency circulation. Price controls and rationing expanded to additional goods. Air operations intensified across Europe. Allied air forces conducted sustained bombing campaigns against industrial centers, transportation networks, and urban areas. German air defense units expanded operations. Anti-aircraft artillery deployments increased. Fighter units conducted interception missions. Aircraft losses rose. Civil defense measures expanded within Germany. Air raid shelters were constructed and reinforced. Evacuation programs relocated civilians from targeted areas. Emergency services operated continuously. Industrial facilities implemented protective measures and dispersed production where feasible. Naval operations continued. Submarine deployments persisted against maritime traffic. Loss rates increased due to enhanced enemy countermeasures. Shipbuilding programs attempted to replace losses. Training of naval personnel continued under constrained conditions. Military operations in other theaters continued under strain. In North Africa, German and Allied forces conducted operations under increasing supply shortages. Air and naval interdiction limited reinforcement and resupply. Engagements continued until organized resistance ceased in May 1943. Following the conclusion of operations in North Africa, personnel and equipment losses were recorded. Command structures were reorganized. Remaining forces were redeployed where possible. Strategic positions were adjusted accordingly. In the summer of 1943, major operations occurred on the Eastern Front. Large-scale engagements involved extensive armored, infantry, and air forces. Combat intensity was high. Losses in personnel and equipment were significant on both sides. German forces conducted defensive and counteroffensive actions. Logistics demands have increased. Fuel consumption rose sharply. Supply depots were targeted by air attack. Transportation networks suffered damage. Repair units worked continuously to restore rail and road capacity. Industrial output remained high but faced increasing disruption. Bombing damaged factories, rail hubs, and power infrastructure. Production schedules were adjusted. Facilities were repaired, relocated, or dispersed. Output fluctuations occurred across sectors. Labor shortages intensified. Additional labor sources were mobilized through administrative measures. Working hours increased. Labor discipline regulations were enforced. Productivity pressures increased. Fiscal pressures expanded. Budgetary allocations rose. Borrowing increased. Debt instruments were issued under state authority. Monetary controls remained in effect. Inflationary pressures were managed through price regulation and rationing. Political and administrative institutions continued to operate under centralized authority. Ministries coordinated war production, labor allocation, transportation, and security. Courts functioned under wartime procedures. Police and security agencies exercised expanded enforcement authority. Security operations expanded in the occupied territories. Administrative controls regulated population movement, labor utilization, and resource extraction. Detention facilities are operated under military and police authority. Judicial processes functioned under wartime regulations. Foreign diplomatic engagement remained limited. Neutral states maintained constrained economic relations. Communications addressed trade, transit, and humanitarian issues. Diplomatic activity focused on maintaining supply routes and access to strategic materials. Military command structures issued directives addressing force redistribution, defensive priorities, and resource allocation. Planning documents reflected adjustments to operational scope and tempo. Training programs for replacements continued without interruption. Civilian conditions within Germany reflected increased strain. Rationing levels tightened. Food, fuel, and consumer goods were limited. Transportation prioritized military and industrial needs. Civil defense procedures remained in effect. By late 1943, German armed forces operated primarily in defensive roles across multiple theaters. Losses sustained during the year reduced operational flexibility. Industrial and administrative systems continued to function under emergency regulation and sustained attack. In 1944, Germany conducted military operations under conditions of sustained territorial loss, severe manpower depletion, and escalating destruction of industrial and urban infrastructure. Armed forces operated continuously across multiple fronts. Civil administration functioned under expanded emergency authority. Industrial production persisted amid mounting disruption. Military operations intensified in early 1944. On the Eastern Front, German forces conducted defensive actions against large-scale offensives. Units withdrew from extended positions under pressure. Losses in personnel and equipment continued. Replacement flows failed to restore unit strength to authorized levels. On the Western Front, German forces prepared defensive positions along the Atlantic coast. Fortifications were constructed and reinforced. Engineering units expanded coastal obstacles, bunkers, and artillery positions. Logistics commands stockpiled limited supplies under increasing air attack. Air operations against Germany expanded significantly. Allied air forces conducted sustained bombing campaigns targeting transportation networks, oil facilities, industrial centers, and urban areas. Rail yards, bridges, and fuel installations were repeatedly struck. Industrial output suffered interruptions. Repair crews operated continuously to restore damaged facilities. Fuel shortages intensified. Synthetic fuel production declined following repeated attacks on processing plants. Allocation authorities imposed strict rationing for military and civilian use. The training activity was curtailed. Operational mobility was reduced across all services. In June 1944, Allied forces landed in northern France. German units engaged in defensive operations under air and artillery superiority. Reinforcements were constrained by damaged transportation networks and fuel scarcity. Armored formations suffered losses during counterattacks. Command structures attempted to coordinate withdrawals and countermeasures. Ground combat in Western Europe intensified during the summer. German forces withdrew from France following sustained engagements. Equipment losses were substantial. Personnel casualties increased. Remaining units retreated toward prepared defensive lines. In July 1944, an internal attempt to remove the head of government occurred. The attempt failed. Subsequent security operations followed. Arrests, investigations, and executions were conducted through military and police authority. Command structures were reorganized. Loyalty procedures were expanded across military and civil institutions. Security agencies expanded enforcement authority. Surveillance increased. Preventive detention was applied broadly. Courts operated under accelerated procedures. Special tribunals processed cases related to treason and military discipline. Military mobilization intensified. Additional age cohorts were conscripted. Training periods were shortened. Newly formed units were deployed with limited preparation. Equipment shortages affected combat effectiveness. Industrial production continued under emergency measures. Underground facilities were expanded. Dispersal of manufacturing sites increased. Output persisted but declined in volume and quality. Skilled labor shortages worsened. Foreign labor utilization expanded further. Forced labor from occupied territories was directed to industrial and agricultural production. Administrative agencies coordinated allocation and supervision. Living conditions deteriorated. Productivity declined under worsening conditions. Civilian conditions deteriorated sharply. Urban destruction displaced large populations. Housing shortages increased. Rationing levels declined. Food distribution became irregular in several regions. Transportation disruptions affected supply chains. Civil defense measures continued. Evacuations expanded from targeted cities. Emergency shelters operated continuously. Medical services were overwhelmed by casualties from air raids and combat operations. In late 1944, military operations continued under deteriorating conditions. On the Western Front, German forces launched a large-scale counteroffensive in December. Initial advances occurred in limited sectors. Supply shortages and air opposition constrained operations. Losses mounted. The offensive ceased without achieving sustained objectives. On the Eastern Front, renewed offensives forced further withdrawals. Major cities and industrial regions were lost. Transportation infrastructure collapsed in several areas. Refugee flows increased. Administrative control weakened in frontline regions. Naval operations continued under severe constraint. Submarine losses increased due to improved enemy countermeasures. Training output declined. Shipbuilding failed to replace losses at the required rates. Surface operations were minimal. Air Force operations declined significantly. Aircraft losses exceeded replacement capacity. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. Training programs were curtailed. Air defense relied increasingly on anti-aircraft artillery. Fiscal administration continued under emergency regulation. Revenue collection declined. Expenditure increased. Borrowing expanded through state credit instruments. Monetary controls remained in effect. Inflationary pressures were managed through strict price controls and rationing. Political and administrative institutions continued to function formally. Ministries issued decrees governing labor allocation, evacuation, transportation priority, and resource distribution. Courts operated under emergency procedures. Police and security agencies enforced compliance. By early 1945, German forces faced simultaneous offensives from east and west. Defensive lines collapsed in multiple sectors. Communications broke down. Command coordination deteriorated. Units surrendered or retreated independently as centralized control weakened. Urban centers experienced heavy bombardment and ground combat. Infrastructure damage was extensive. Water, electricity, and transport services failed in many areas. Civil administration operated intermittently or ceased functioning locally. In March and April 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced rapidly through Western Germany. On the Eastern Front, opposing forces entered German territory and advanced toward major population centers. Military resistance varied by region and unit. Conscription expanded to include the remaining available manpower. Improvised formations were deployed. Equipment shortages were acute. Training was minimal or absent. Combat effectiveness was limited. Security agencies continued enforcement operations. Desertion and unauthorized surrender were punished under military law. Summary courts operated in several areas. Discipline measures intensified as cohesion declined. Civilian suffering increased. Refugee movements overwhelmed the remaining infrastructure. Food shortages intensified. Medical services collapsed in many regions. Administrative authority is fragmented at the local levels. In April 1945, opposing forces entered Berlin. Urban combat occurred. Government institutions ceased effective operation. Communications failed. Administrative orders became irregular or unenforceable. On April 30th, 1945, the head of government died in Berlin. Subsequent authority transfers were announced through the remaining command structures. Military operations continued in several regions despite the collapse of central governance. On 7 to 8 May 1945, German military representatives signed instruments of surrender. Armed forces ceased organized resistance. Orders were transmitted to the remaining units. Hostilities ended across European theaters. Following the surrender, military units were disarmed. Personnel were taken into captivity. Administrative institutions ceased operation or were placed under Allied authority. Police and security organizations were dissolved or disarmed. Civil administration collapsed at the national level. Regional authorities operated temporarily under Allied supervision. Infrastructure lay in ruins. Industrial production halted. Transportation networks were destroyed or inoperable. By the end of May 1945, Germany no longer functioned as a sovereign state. Military defeat was complete. The central authority had dissolved. The territory was occupied by foreign forces. Administrative continuity existed only at local levels under external control. In 1945, Germany ceased to exist as a sovereign state. Supreme authority was passed to the Allied powers following unconditional surrender. Military structures were dissolved. Central government institutions no longer functioned. The territory was divided into occupation zones administered by foreign military authorities. Armed forces were disbanded by directive. Personnel were disarmed and interned. Military command structures were dissolved. Equipment was confiscated, destroyed, or transferred. Training establishments were closed. Military law ceased to operate. Civil administration collapsed at the national level. Ministries ceased operation. Remaining civil servants operated under Allied supervision or were dismissed. Administrative continuity existed only at the regional and municipal levels under occupation authority. Occupation zones were established. Each zone operated under distinct administrative arrangements. Allied military governments exercised legislative, executive, and judicial authority. Orders and directives replaced domestic law. German courts resumed limited operation under occupation oversight. In May 1945, occupation authorities issued directives dissolving political organizations associated with the former regime. Party structures were banned. Assets were confiscated. Public symbols were removed. Administrative enforcement proceeded through military government orders. Denazification programs were initiated. Administrative questionnaires were distributed. Screening processes categorized individuals by prior affiliation and activity. Employment restrictions were applied. Appeals procedures varied by zone. Judicial processes addressed crimes committed during the war period. Military tribunals operated under Allied authority. Civil courts resumed limited jurisdiction for non-political cases. Legal continuity was selectively restored under occupation regulation. Economic conditions were severe. Industrial production was largely halted. Transportation networks were damaged or destroyed. Fuel shortages were acute. Agricultural output was disrupted. Food rationing was implemented under the occupation administration. Currency systems remained unstable. Existing currency has lost purchasing power. Barter systems expanded. Black markets developed. Administrative authorities struggled to regulate exchange and distribution. Population displacement was extensive. Refugees and expelled populations moved across the occupation zones. Housing shortages were severe. Emergency accommodations were established. Municipal authorities managed registration and relief under occupation supervision. In 1946, Allied authorities authorized limited political activity. Political parties were permitted to form under licensing requirements. Party platforms were subject to review. Elections were scheduled at the municipal and regional levels in several zones. Regional administrations were established. Lander governments operated under occupation authority. Legislative bodies were elected or appointed according to zone-specific regulations. Powers were limited by military government oversight. Economic reconstruction programs began. Industrial dismantling occurred in selected sectors. Equipment was removed as reparations. Production capacity declined further in affected industries. Other sectors resumed limited output under license. Food supply remained critical. Agricultural deliveries were requisitioned. Ration levels varied by zone. Relief shipments supplemented the domestic supply. Public health conditions remained fragile. Education systems reopened under revised curricula. Teaching personnel were screened. Textbooks were replaced. Administrative oversight ensured compliance with occupation directives. In 1947, occupation authorities adjusted administrative structures. Bizonal economic administration was established between the western zones. Joint agencies coordinated food supply, transportation, and economic planning. Currency instability persisted. Judicial systems expanded their operation. German judges resumed duties under supervision. Legal continuity was selectively restored. Occupation courts retained jurisdiction over designated matters. Denazification procedures continued. Case volumes increased. Administrative backlogs developed. Enforcement varied by zone and region. Employment restrictions were gradually modified. Economic activity remained constrained. Industrial output increased slowly. Infrastructure repairs progressed unevenly. Transportation services resumed limited operation. Fuel shortages persisted. In June 1948, a currency reform was implemented in the western zones. A new currency was introduced. Old currency was withdrawn under a regulated exchange. Price controls were lifted in stages. Monetary stability improved rapidly. Following currency reform, economic activity increased. Retail trade resumed. Industrial production expanded. Agricultural markets stabilized. Transportation services improved. Administrative tax collection resumed under revised frameworks. In response, Eastern Zone authorities implemented a separate currency reform. Administrative separation between zones intensified. Economic coordination across zones ceased. Border controls increased. Political institutions developed along divergent lines. In Western zones, parliamentary bodies expanded authority under occupation supervision. Constitutional drafting processes were initiated at the regional level. In 1948, a parliamentary council convened to draft a constitutional framework for a new Western German state. Deliberations occurred under Allied oversight. Institutional design addressed federal structure, legislative authority, and executive limits. In the Eastern Zone, administrative structures were consolidated under centralized authority. Political organizations were reorganized. Economic planning institutions expanded. State ownership increased in key sectors. In May 1949, a constitutional document was promulgated in the Western zones. It established a federal republic with defined legislative, executive, and judicial institutions. Authority remained subject to Allied reservation powers. Elections were scheduled under the new framework. Political parties operated within constitutional parameters. Administrative institutions resumed national-level functions under limited sovereignty. In October 1949, a separate state structure was proclaimed in the Eastern Zone. Centralized political authority was established. Administrative institutions operated under distinct constitutional arrangements. By 1949, Germany existed as two separate political entities under opposing systems of governance. Occupation authority continued in modified form. Sovereignty remained constrained by external powers. Public interpretation of the war period varied across regions and administrations. Legal proceedings, educational policy, and political discourse addressed the recent past under differing frameworks. Institutional continuity and rupture coexisted within administrative practice. Military structures remained dissolved. Security functions were limited. Economic recovery proceeded under divergent systems. Political authority was reconstituted under new constitutional arrangements. The period concluded with Germany re-established as separate states, operating under external constraints, divergent political systems, and unresolved legal and historical questions. Administrative order had been restored in new forms. The wartime state had ceased to exist.